This is a Mike Lee News Update. Fallout from the Trump-Kim Summit. Where do we go from here? Professor Armstrong, what say you?
Well, the failure of the summit and the collapse of the talks was unexpected and a great disappointment for all parties concerned. But it's not the end of dialogue between the U.S. and North Korea. Both sides have said that they will continue to remain engaged, and there will be further talks down the line.
We're speaking with Professor Charles Armstrong of Columbia University, also a contributor to my podcast series on Korea. Did this take you by surprise, or did you see it coming?
I did not see that coming, but I was not alone. There were people who were skeptical that this could lead to a substantive outcome, but most observers, I think, saw that this was something that Trump and Kim both very much wanted to succeed. And the bigger concern of many of Trump's critics was that he would give too much away. In fact, that almost the opposite happened. He walked away without conceding anything, but also without gaining anything. So the North Koreans were quite stunned. The South Koreans were gravely disappointed. And the Vietnamese hosts were really shocked as well, from what I understand.
All right, so let's break that down. Is it a good thing or a bad thing, and from whose perspective?
Well, many have been saying that no deal is better than a bad deal, and there's something to that argument. But there could have been much more, at least some progress made in U.S.-North Korean relations. There were possibilities for concessions on both sides that could have moved the process along. It would have been unrealistic to expect a major peace declaration or announcement of normalization or anything that dramatic. But to have the talks collapse with nothing accomplished, not even a symbolic handshake, is a real setback.
Well, in a setback for, I guess, the Korean Peninsula, if you're expecting or hoping for a short-term either reunification or a further step forward on denuclearization. But there's an argument perhaps to be made that if you step away from it a bit and take a broader picture, then you might get a better result in the long run. Do you find any validity in that?
Well, we're certainly in a better place than we were 15 months ago when it looked like the U.S. and North Korea were on the brink of nuclear war. As I said, both the U.S. and North Korea maintain that they will continue to negotiate, although at a lower level. But no doubt some of the momentum has been lost. The current situation is sustainable for now, which is that North Korea maintains its freeze on nuclear and missile testing, and the U.S. maintains its sanctions on North Korea pending any move toward greater nuclear disarmament or dismantlement. But it's hard to see how long that can last before something has to give, and it's conceivable that if the North Korea continues to feel that it can't get anything more out of the U.S., then they'll resume testing. They will go back to developing more aggressively their nuclear program. So we're in a stable but still dangerous place right now.
Well, to a large degree, this is a question of how severe sanctions have and will bite on the North Koreans.
Well, there's no doubt that sanctions have had a strong effect on North Korea recently, and that the main goal of the North Koreans was to get some kind of sanctions relief, because they're definitely hurting. But the question is, what will the U.S. gain from continuing to put sanctions pressure on North Korea? Will they cry uncle and come up with a plan for a complete opening up of their nuclear program and unilateral disarmament? It's not likely given North Korea's track record. So it seems to me that the smart thing to do would be to take this step by step, to have partial denuclearization in exchange for some partial relief of sanctions. And we may get back to that. That's probably the best way forward. But it's not clear when we can get back to that and what exactly the next steps will be.
Two things occur to me. The first one is, why do you think the United States didn't go for that? Why would it not be in the U.S. interest to do that? They obviously had a reason for walking.
Well, I don't know exactly what went on in those discussions, and we may never know. But it seems that the U.S. came to the conclusion that the North Koreans just weren't giving enough, and that signing a deal or making a declaration without further concrete steps of denuclearization would have been just conceding to the North Koreans, and it would have looked bad politically. It would have made the U.S. give up its leverage over North Korea in terms of sanctions, and it just wasn't worth proceeding.
In other words, under that scenario, North Korea would have been able to declare victory of some kind because sanctions had been eased. They might say to their domestic audience, we basically wiped out sanctions, life will improve. And the perception by the West would be, well, there's no more incentive, which leads me to my second question. Go ahead and tell me whether you agree with that, first of all.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that the North Koreans would have portrayed this as a victory. And on the U.S. side, there seems to have been a concern that if sanctions were lifted too far and too quickly, then they would have lost the only real leverage they have over North Korea, and then they wouldn't have got any more real progress on denuclearization.
So doesn't that make it all seem more or less logical, what happened?
It's logical, but I think there are ways in which this could have reached a more satisfactory conclusion on both sides, rather than this dramatic collapse of the talks that we saw in Hanoi.
And how would that have been in your view?
What the North Koreans apparently proposed is that they dismantle their main nuclear plant in Yongbyon in exchange for what they call partial lifting of sanctions, some sanctions in a number of areas of civilian engagement and aid. That was more than the Americans were willing to give, certainly, but it wasn't, at least from how the North Koreans portray it, a demand for a complete lifting of sanctions, which is the way that Trump expressed it at his press conference. That was clearly a maximum position that they could have walked back, talked down, in my view, and conceded less. So maybe walking away it was a logical thing to do, and maybe we'll get back to talks that will lead to a better conclusion from the U.S. point of view. But there's also the danger that we will not get back to talks, and we'll be back to where we were a couple of years ago, which would be very dangerous.
Dangerous for North Korea as well.
Yes, absolutely. They're very concerned about the economic situation. Kim Jong-un has made it a priority to improve the country's economy. The sanctions appear to be taking a toll and will continue to worsen the situation in North Korea. So there's a lot for them to lose. But I don't see how we will get to a better place if the North Koreans feel more sanctions pressure.
I want to ask you about the broader economic picture in a moment, but first of all, when you say sanctions are biting, and in what way do you actually read that?
Of course, it's hard to know exactly what's going on in North Korea. We have to speculate based on various reports and data that we get from outside. But the amount of trade with China has gone down dramatically, and China is by far North Korea's largest trading partner. There's a lot less cash flowing through the economy. The situation in the cities is not as good as it had been just a couple of years ago. And so it's not yet a catastrophe. And the economy in general in North Korea has always been pretty poor, but the rather modest improvement that we'd seen in recent years has apparently ground to a halt from everything I've heard, and there's a worry that it's going to just get worse.
But does that mean that people are going hungry and or not getting treated medically? Is it that bad, or are we talking about an economic slowdown where things don't get, jobs don't get pay raises, and people don't get to go to school. Not that these things are minor by any stretch, but when you compare that to starving and or dying from ill health, where does it stand as far as you can tell?
Well, it's not starvation. The situation in the countryside has always been one of near subsistence, or has been for a long time. But the problem, as I see it in North Korea, is there has been a kind of revolution of rising expectations in recent years within the cities, particularly in Pyongyang, the capital, and that is hitting a wall with the sanctions. So it's not so much that the situation is getting dramatically worse, but the expectation that people's lives would get better is getting disappointed. And in all kinds of historical situations, that's the greatest political danger for an authoritarian regime. Not when the situation is dire and catastrophic, but when people's expectations of improvement are dashed.
I'm going to ask you to expand on that in just a second, but I wanted to first ask you about Trump's repeated motto that North Korea can be a great economic power, can be a great place, it's got all this potential and so forth. But do the North Koreans want to hear that, or do they want to hear, I need more food and we need more of the basics? I mean, Trump seems to have this vision of an economic powerhouse. Does that necessarily translate into making people feel good in North Korea when they hear that sort of thing?
North Korea has a long way to go before it could be an economic dynamo in East Asia. They're in some ways in a worse situation, or a more difficult situation, than, say, China and Vietnam at the beginning of their reform, when there was a lot of room in the agricultural sector to move and to transfer resources into development. But there is great potential there, to be sure. The North Korean people are like the South Korean people, have been known to be a very hardworking and disciplined group. But what North Koreans, I think, want to hear is not so much that someday there will be a great economic power. That no doubt makes some people feel good, but that they'll have more food to eat, better housing, and that their daily lives will improve. As I've said, they have improved somewhat in recent years, and unless there are some serious changes made in the economy which are dependent on some relief of sanctions, the improvement is not going to continue, and that is what I think concerns people.
Let's follow up on what you said about rising expectations hitting a wall. Mm-hmm. Is there a political danger here to Kim? I mean, he is absolute ruler, yeah. But is there a crack in the facade in terms of his ability to hang on to power if things get really worse? And if so or not, how does that factor, in your view, into U.S. strategy?
Well, dictatorships are absolute until they're not. Change can happen very suddenly, as we've seen in Romania in 1989, for example, under the Ceausescu dictatorship. And what Kim is worried about is not so much the average Korean farmer, who's very distant from any kind of political concerns, but with a sort of elite or growing upper middle class in North Korea, who will be quite unhappy if their situation gets worse, and discontent will grow. It's hard to imagine a major uprising in North Korea, but Kim does have to make sure that members of the elite around him are reasonably satisfied. And at some point, it is possible that if people in the military or in the party elite see that their situation is really getting appreciably worse, they could do something to try to constrain him.
Well, it's a very important point. Impossible to predict, but is it potentially possible that the elite that you speak of, mainly military people, might think it to their advantage, to the country's advantage, at some point, if it gets as bad as you say it could potentially, to replace him. And if they did, I don't know anything about how the mood is of the elite in terms of what they really think about Kim's policy, but I would imagine, would you not, that U.S. planners would hope that if that ever happened, there would be a more moderate replacement.
Well, that's been the hope of American planners for decades. But the resilience of the Kim regime is not to be underestimated. On the one hand, Kim is concerned about criticism and even opposition from some of the elites around him, but it would really take something quite extreme. Things would have to get much worse before anyone would seriously consider replacing him. And that is not a contingency that U.S. should base its policy on. In other words, Kim is the leader for the foreseeable future, and he's the leader we'll have to deal with.
In other words, if the U.S. even gave a thought to the calculus of let's make things so bad that the elite, some of whom feel a bit more moderate about things, might replace him. Because I don't know if you agree or not, but it seems to me that if you push him far enough, you might push him closer to the button, and that's a very dangerous game.
Yes, if he feels his existence as a leader is threatened, he may decide that the best thing to do is to provoke a confrontation rather than be removed.
To then surround him, to get people to rally to his side that might not otherwise within his own country.
Right, exactly. And don't forget, this is a regime under Kim's father, which went through a period of mass starvation in the 1990s, and his leadership survived. So that's the other danger, that you'll have tremendous suffering among the North Korean people before this regime would give in.
On the other hand, the flip side of that discussion might be to point toward Trump's continual compliments toward Kim, calling him a nice guy and they get along and so forth. So do you see that Trump is trying to steer away from that kind of drastic scenario we just spoke of by being sort of a pastoral partner toward Kim? Is that part of the technique? I mean, I can't imagine that Trump is warm-hearted toward Kim. It's just probably not in either of their personalities to do that, but that's their public persona.
Trump does seem to have a habit of saying complimentary things to dictators. It's not clear why he does that. And it looks like he does genuinely like Kim for whatever reason. But one of the things we should have learned from the collapse of the Hanoi talks is that this kind of personal one-on-one diplomacy has its limits. And it seems that the U.S. side wasn't fully prepared for the kind of detailed work that it would have been required to reach a satisfactory outcome. So, being nice to Kim is perhaps a good way to get the North Koreans to come to the table. But that alone is not enough, and it has to be coordinated with some really hard-nosed and realistic negotiation. Whether or not we have a third summit remains to be seen, but if we do, it would behoove the U.S. to really have a deal pretty much in place before the two leaders meet, rather than what seems to have been happening this time, which was a lot of improvising on the ground.
I was wondering about that because, as any diplomat worth his or her salt will tell you, the only useful summit is one in which you know the results before you ever shake hands. That all that groundwork basically would have been done. You know that as well. So I'm wondering what your view is in terms of why it came out the way it did, considering that you've got Mike Pompeo, who seems to be very much involved in this. He must have known even before he got to Hanoi that they weren't going to sign a deal unless they kind of banked on some extemporaneous change, which is isn't a very necessarily mature thing to do.
Mm. Well, the North Koreans certainly have a share of the blame as well. They didn't meet with the special envoy to North Korea, Steve Biegun, until a couple of weeks before the summit. And they apparently miscalculated as well and thought they could get more from the U.S. than they in fact could, and might have seen Trump as being in a weak political position and willing to concede more than he was in the end able to do. So there was certainly miscalculation and lack of adequate preparation probably on both sides. As to why that's the case, there are many factors that went into it, and I don't know all the details of what went on. We did have experienced people on our side working on the ground, but there doesn't seem to have been enough communication between the two to really hammer out the details before the summit took place, and by that time it was too late.
Professor Charles Armstrong at Columbia University, thank you very much once again for your contributions.
You're welcome. Thank you.
This has been a Mike Lee News Update.